Okay, so this is what we did on Monday. This was this was an interview record that I did with somebody at a group called Americans for Prosperity. This was one of the groups. I don't know if you remember, you don't remember back to the Tea Party, but there was discussion, is this AstroTurf, is this genuine grassroots movement? And this was one of the groups that was accused of AstroTurfing the Tea Parties.
I'm familiar with them, actually.
Oh, okay, good, good. And so I interviewed I guess their volunteer director. And so my question was, were they actually AstroTurfing Tea Partiers? Okay, so this was a topical issue, and so I wanted to do interviews instead of just kind of sitting around in AFP conference rooms. And so what I did, I went through this interview record. I wonder, can I move this over? No. And jotted down notes about what she said. Because what I want to do when you're coding, what you want to do is take a big, long text. So in this case, this was 4 pages. In the project, it's like 60 pages. And shrink it down to a really manageable list, because you don't want to go through 60 pages all the time. So I went through and put little notes here in the margins. Let's see, I don't know if I can, is that exposing more of the, can you see? Okay. So for example, this paragraph here, well, I put she tried for years, she tried different groups. You know, I didn't want to put down each particular group, as that would be essentially rewriting the whole interview record. So I just made these little tiny notes. Personally, when I do this, I like to print out on a sheet of paper and jot down the margins, but we can, you know, everybody does electronically now, I suppose. So these little memos to myself about what this is, these are codes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And you're going to go through and have a whole bunch of, this is what's called coding, is jotting these things down. One question about what to code, right? So for example, there's information here. She's from Michigan, her mother was at Hillsdale, and so on. She worked for Jesse Helms. But none of this is really relevant to my question, okay? So I'm just gonna let this go as water under the bridge. I'm not gonna try to code everything. I only wanna code what is relevant to my particular question. Otherwise, it's just too much.
Mm-hmm.
We go through, there's some more of these, right? The fact that her son is a fan of Ron Paul, I don't care. I mean, you know, maybe I care as a person and it's interesting, but I don't care as a researcher focused on, is this AstroTurf or not? But here, on the other hand, she would like to take credit for this movement, but she can't. That's a clear quote directly usable for my research. So I put that, so I, you know, memo that, make a code. So I went through, made a bunch of these. I have this recorded, so if you want to actually look at the codes, you can go through and take a look. What she did, various stories here. Then I go through all of this. I don't know, maybe this could be coded, maybe not. So part of coding, there is no hard and fast formula for what should be coded or what should not be coded, okay? If it strikes you as very obvious that it's related to your question, then you should definitely code it. If it's not related, then don't code it. If it's kind of like, well, maybe,
mm-hmm.
then I would code it, but don't be afraid to let it go and not include it in your outline at the end. You know, when I went, actually, I went through and did that whole, the project that you guys are going to do. I went through and did it myself early this summer, and I had a lot of codes that in the end I didn't end up using, but
mm-hmm.
you know, that's okay. That's fine.
It's just, there's a lot of pages, so.
There are, and I'm trying to think, I don't know what I came up with. There's a lot of repeated coding in what I did, but again, I think it is, what's the word? Not inefficient, but it is, the idea of coding is to pull out what is relevant. And so if you do too much, then it's not useful.
Right.
Right? So be judicious and be, you can save yourself a lot of time later by putting some effort into trying to think about, is this relevant, is this not relevant, during the coding step. Because if you can weed stuff out at the coding step, later on it'll be much easier.
So do you think like most people will have different results or similar results? Because I feel like some of the information you'd highlight kind of would be based on your prior knowledge in a way, because some things
Well,
might stick out more than one another.
maybe so, maybe so. Some of the stuff is, I think, will be pretty similar. Like, for example, one of the early interviews talks about where a politician says, oh, you know, they might not go legal because it'll be expensive.
Right.
And I think that's a pretty obvious statement that everybody's going to code, right? But I think later, some of the illegals, like where they start talking about, you know, their sort of their family history and how does that affect them. I think it's fair. And I think any qualitative researcher would agree that what some people are going to code, other people are going to code differently.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't have a list of like, you have to have these codes, you know, in order to get points. You know, I just want to see that you put some thought into what codes you use.
Mm-hmm.
So once you've had all these, once you've gotten, or sorry, did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Once I coded all of this, you see here, these A, B, C, D through E and E through I, these are all the codes that I put up there on the right side of the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Margins, okay?
So you group them.
So that's right, I grouped them into categories, and we call these categories themes. That's where the term thematic analysis comes from. It's kind of a fancy word for a category. So you see how I have this, like, you know, it didn't work. There's a whole bunch of quotes, not quotes, but things she said at various points in the interview to suggest that she actually wasn't able to do very much until 2009, okay? And then 2009 came along, and she did actually have a role to play, at least early in the movement, right? Those first few sort of, you know, very exciting months in summer 2009. But then by the end, you know, she basically concludes that she actually wasn't able to do very much in the end. And she sort of went off for a little bit on the personality type of Tea Party leaders, right? These are the people that didn't get along with the GOP, and so they left to form their own groups by and large. So this is how I coded and thematically analyzed this particular interview report. Now, to be fair, so I've done this for a long time, and I knew what I was looking for. In my report, I left out anything that was sort of irrelevant, and I put a lot of stuff in that was. And so this is much, much more dense than the interviews that you'll be reading for the project. So you should not expect, you should not expect to have anywhere near as many codes per interview as I do. Okay, for this particular interview. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if you had like this many codes and 3 or 4 themes for the entire 60 pages of interviews. I mean, I think if you have probably this much of an outline, sorry, that's probably more than enough for the project.
Okay.
Okay. Now, where do these themes come from? Inductive reasoning is a technical term. Be creative. How do you just kind of sit there and look at them for a while and think about them for a while, and how do you group them into maybe 3 or 4 groups? And so a lot of that is part of the fun of observational research and doing thematic analysis, is you get to be creative and kind of come up with things yourselves, instead of just like calculating averages. So does that answer your question or questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I have one note. This is just kind of off though. I don't know if you're still recording that, but
okay.